Child locked himself in bathroom before trip. Wife messaged, the train derailed completely. My son was behind a locked bathroom door at 6:52 a.m. on a Saturday morning, refusing to come out, refusing to explain why, refusing to acknowledge that we had exactly 23 minutes to get to Union Station for the 7:15 Cascades Express to Vancouver. Ethan was 6 years old, generally easygoing, the kind of kid who loved trains and had been talking about this trip for weeks, counting down the days until we'd ride the rails up the coast with views of Puget Sound and the Pacific Northwest landscape he'd seen in picture books. But right then, with our bags packed, and my wife Rebecca already in the car with our luggage and our tickets purchased and our hotel reservation confirmed, Ethan had locked himself in our downstairs bathroom and started screaming that we couldn't go, that something bad would happen, that he wouldn't leave no matter what we said. I stood outside the bathroom door trying to negotiate with a 6-year-old through half an inch of wood while checking my watch every 30 seconds and calculating whether we could still make the train if he came out in the next 5 minutes. Rebecca was calling my phone, asking what was taking so long, saying we needed to leave immediately or we'd miss departure. I told her Ethan was having some kind of episode and I couldn't get him out. She said to break the door down if necessary because we'd been planning this trip for 3 months and she wasn't missing it because our son decided to have a tantrum. I told her I'd handle it and hung up. Then I heard the explosion. Not literally an explosion at that moment, but that's what I think about now when I remember that morning. The moment everything normal ended and something incomprehensible began. I was an environmental engineer for the Port of Seattle, spent my days analyzing water quality and contamination levels and infrastructure safety protocols. I dealt in facts and data and measurable outcomes. I'd been married to Rebecca for 9 years, had built a stable life in a 3-bedroom house in Ballard, had a career and a mortgage, and a son who was bright and curious and showed no signs of psychological problems or premonitory abilities. We were planning a long weekend in Vancouver, a family vacation that would be Ethan's first international trip, his first experience on a passenger train, his first time crossing a border. We'd shown him maps and videos and explained what to expect. He'd been excited, packed his backpack with books and toys and snacks, laid out his favorite blue jacket the night before. Then, Saturday morning arrived, and something changed in him so completely that he physically barricaded himself in a bathroom rather than get in the car. I tried reasoning with him through the door, explaining that trains were safe, that Vancouver was fun, that we'd miss the departure if he didn't come out right now. He screamed that we couldn't get on the train, that it was going to crash, that everyone would die. I asked him why he thought that. He said he'd dreamed it, that he'd seen it happen, that he knew we'd die if we got on that train. I told him dreams weren't real, that his fear was understandable but not based in reality, that thousands of people rode trains every day without incident. He said he didn't care what I thought. He wasn't getting on that train, and neither was I. Rebecca called again at 6:58 a.m., her voice tight with frustration, saying we had 17 minutes, and if we left right now we might barely make it, but we had to leave immediately. I told her Ethan was saying the train was going to crash, that he'd had a nightmare and was too scared to travel. She said to tell him the dream wasn't real and to get him in the car in the next 2 minutes, or she was leaving without us. I said we couldn't just abandon our son because he was having a panic attack. She said we also couldn't let a 6-year-old's bad dream ruin a vacation we'd spent $1,400 planning. The argument escalated until I said something I regret, something about her priorities being completely wrong, and she hung up on me. At 7:03 a.m., I heard the car start in the driveway. Through our front window, I watched Rebecca back out onto the street, her face visible through the windshield, expression set in anger and determination. She was actually leaving, going to catch the train by herself because I couldn't get our son out of the bathroom. I called her immediately, told her to stop, to come back, that we'd figure this out together. She said she'd waited long enough, that she was going to make the train with or without us, that if Ethan was too scared, then fine, we could stay home, but she wasn't canceling the entire trip because of a nightmare. I asked her to please just wait, to give me 10 more minutes to talk to Ethan, to at least try to handle this as a family. She said the train left at 7:15 and she wasn't missing it. Then she hung up again, and I watched our car turn the corner and disappear from view, carrying my wife toward Union Station and the Cascades Express that my son was certain would crash. I sat down on the floor outside the bathroom door, trying to process what had just happened, trying to decide if I should force the door open and drag Ethan to the station to stop Rebecca, or if I should stay home and let her take this trip alone and deal with the marriage fallout later. Ethan had gone quiet inside the bathroom. No more screaming, just silence. I asked if he was okay. He said very softly that he was sorry, but he couldn't let us get on the train, that something bad was going to happen, and he had to keep us safe. The certainty in his voice was unsettling, not the wavering fear of a child with general anxiety, but the flat conviction of someone stating an undeniable fact. I'd worked with risk assessment professionals, people who analyzed threats and calculated probabilities and made safety recommendations based on evidence. Ethan sounded like them, like he possessed information I didn't have access to, like his fear wasn't irrational but based on knowledge he couldn't articulate. I asked him what exactly he'd dreamed. He described a train going very fast through mountains, then shaking violently, then tipping over and sliding down an embankment while people screamed and metal tore apart and windows shattered. He said he'd seen it so clearly, it felt like a memory rather than a dream, and that when he woke up, he knew with absolute certainty that if we got on the 7:15 train, we would die. At 7:18 a.m., 3 minutes after the Cascades Express was scheduled to depart Union Station, my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. The message was a single word: leaving. I texted back asking her to please reconsider, to please get off the train and come home so we could talk about this rationally. She didn't respond. I tried calling and got voicemail. Tried again, and it went straight to voicemail, meaning she'd turned her phone off or silenced it completely. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to decide if I was overreacting, or if Rebecca was being unreasonable, or if we were both just stressed and handling it badly, and whether this fight would be something we could laugh about later, or something that created permanent damage in our marriage. Ethan unlocked the bathroom door at 7:24 a.m. and came out looking exhausted and scared, his face blotchy from crying. He asked if Mom had left. I said yes. He asked if she'd gotten on the train. I said I thought so. He started crying again, saying we had to stop her, that we had to call someone and make the train stop before it crashed. I told him the train was already gone, that there was nothing we could do, that his dream was just a dream, and Mom would be fine, and we'd talk to her when she reached Vancouver in about 4 hours. At 7:41 a.m., while I was making Ethan breakfast and trying to figure out how to explain to a 6-year-old that adults sometimes make decisions based on priorities rather than fears, my phone started buzzing with news alerts. I picked it up and saw headlines loading in real time. Breaking: Amtrak derailment north of Seattle. Cascades Express train derails near Edmonds. Multiple casualties reported in train crash. I felt my stomach drop into some void that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. Felt my hands start shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Felt a rushing sensation in my ears like I was underwater or falling or experiencing some kind of medical emergency. I opened the news app and saw live footage from a helicopter showing a passenger train lying on its side on an embankment next to the tracks. Several cars accordion folded into each other, emergency vehicles surrounding the scene, people being carried on stretchers, a disaster unfolding in real time barely 15 miles from where I was standing. The Cascades Express, southbound Route 513, had derailed at approximately 7:33 a.m. near the Edmonds waterfront while traveling at high speed through a curve. Early reports indicated multiple fatalities and dozens of injuries. The footage showed the exact scenario Ethan had described: a train on its side, torn metal, shattered windows, chaos and destruction, and people who'd boarded expecting a pleasant weekend trip now dead or dying on a hillside. I called Rebecca's phone probably 80 times in the next 10 minutes, getting voicemail or dead air or that terrible automated message saying the customer was unavailable. I texted her saying, please respond, please tell me you're okay, please confirm you weren't on that train. I called Amtrak's emergency line and got a busy signal. I called the hospital in Edmonds and got transferred 4 times before someone told me they couldn't release patient information over the phone. I turned on the TV and found live coverage on every local channel showing the derailment from multiple angles, reporters describing the scene, officials making preliminary statements, but no passenger list, no names, no way to confirm who had been on that train or who had survived. Ethan stood next to me watching the coverage, his face completely white, his small hand gripping mine with desperate strength. He said in a voice barely above a whisper, I told you it would crash. I couldn't respond, because my throat had closed and my brain couldn't process the reality that my wife might be dead or injured in that wreckage, because I hadn't been able to get our son out of a bathroom in time to stop her from boarding. The official casualty reports started coming in around 8:15 a.m. 6 confirmed dead, 34 seriously injured, 73 with minor injuries, 68 unaccounted for or transported to multiple hospitals across the region. The Cascades Express had been carrying 181 passengers and 6 crew members when it derailed at 7:33 a.m., while traveling southbound through a curve rated for 30 miles per hour at an estimated speed of 79 miles per hour. The train had left Union Station at 7:17 a.m., 2 minutes late, with Rebecca presumably aboard in whatever seat she'd selected when she'd checked in alone. The derailment had occurred 16 minutes into the journey, in a section of track that ran along the Puget Sound waterfront with steep embankments on the inland side. The locomotive and first 3 passenger cars had stayed upright on or near the tracks. The 4th and 5th cars had tipped onto their sides. The 6th car had separated partially from the coupling and slid approximately 40 feet down the embankment before coming to rest against trees. The 7th car had jackknifed and was resting at a 45-degree angle across both tracks. Passenger injuries and fatalities were concentrated in cars 4 through 6, the cars that had experienced the most violent motion during the derailment. I had no idea which car Rebecca had been in, or whether she was among the dead, the injured, or the miraculously unharmed. I drove to Edmonds at 8:23 a.m. with Ethan in the back seat, breaking probably a dozen traffic laws and using shoulders and bike lanes when regular traffic was too slow, trying to get to the crash site where authorities had set up a family reunification center at the Civic Center. The scene was chaos when we arrived. Hundreds of people milling around looking for family members, emergency vehicles blocking streets, police trying to maintain perimeters and control access, reporters with cameras trying to interview survivors and witnesses. I found the check-in desk where Red Cross volunteers were coordinating family notifications and asked about Rebecca Langford, passenger on Cascades Express, Route 513, traveling alone, approximately 5 feet 6 inches, with dark blonde hair, probably wearing jeans and a green jacket. The volunteer, an older woman named Dorothy, who looked exhausted already at 9 a.m., checked her tablet and said Rebecca's name wasn't on the confirmed survivor list yet, wasn't on the confirmed fatality list, but that information was still being compiled as patients were being treated and transported and identified. She said if Rebecca could communicate, she'd be calling me, that I should keep my phone on and wait for contact, that the hospital systems were overwhelmed, and that it might take hours before all passengers were accounted for. I asked if I could access the crash site or the hospitals to search for her myself. Dorothy said absolutely not, that the crash site was an active investigation scene and the hospitals were only accepting critical patients and immediate family with confirmed patient names. I explained that I was immediate family, that Rebecca was my wife, that our son was standing right here and needed to know if his mother was alive. Dorothy looked at Ethan with deep sympathy and said she understood, but that without confirmation of which hospital Rebecca had been transported to, if any, there was nothing she could do except recommend I wait for official notification. Ethan and I sat in the Civic Center for 3 hours while I refreshed news coverage and called hospitals and checked my phone obsessively for any message from Rebecca. Around noon, a woman approached us, introduced herself as Detective Laura Brennan, 16 years with Edmonds Police Department, currently coordinating witness interviews and family notifications related to the derailment. She asked if we were waiting for Rebecca Langford. I confirmed and asked if she had information. Brennan said Rebecca's name was on the passenger manifest and that she'd been located at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, transported there with serious injuries but alive and currently in surgery. The relief hit me so hard I thought I might actually collapse, might just fall to the floor of this Civic Center and cry until I couldn't breathe. Ethan grabbed my arm and asked if Mom was okay. I told him she was alive, she was at the hospital, she was hurt, but alive. Brennan gave me paperwork and directions and her contact information, told me to go to Harborview and ask for the trauma unit, that Rebecca had been identified through her driver's license, and that medical staff would have more information. She paused before leaving and asked how we'd avoided being on the train. I said our son had locked himself in the bathroom this morning and refused to let us board because he'd had a nightmare about a crash. Brennan looked at Ethan with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and disbelief, then said we were very fortunate and that she might need to speak with us again as the investigation progressed. Rebecca was out of surgery by the time we reached Harborview at 1:45 p.m. The surgeon, Dr. Amir Kapoor, 22 years in trauma surgery, explained that Rebecca had sustained multiple injuries consistent with high-impact collision trauma: fractured left femur, fractured ribs, collapsed lung, severe lacerations to her face and arms from broken glass, and a traumatic brain injury that they'd stabilized but would require monitoring. She was sedated and on a ventilator, would likely remain in ICU for several days minimum, faced a long recovery even in the best-case scenario. Dr. Kapoor said she'd been in the 6th car, the one that had slid down the embankment, that her survival was remarkable given the severity of the impact in that section of the train, that if she'd been seated just a few rows forward or back, her injuries might have been fatal. I asked when I could see her. He said briefly that she was unconscious and wouldn't be able to communicate, but that I could visit for 15 minutes with one other person. Ethan came with me to the ICU and stood next to his mother's bed staring at her bandaged face and the tubes and monitors and machinery keeping her alive, his expression completely unreadable. I held Rebecca's hand, careful not to disturb the IV lines, and told her we were there, that she was going to be okay, that I was sorry about the fight that morning, and that nothing mattered except her getting better. She didn't respond, didn't move, just lay there breathing mechanically while machines beeped and tracked her vital signs. The National Transportation Safety Board opened a formal investigation into the derailment on Sunday morning, designating it as a major accident requiring comprehensive analysis of track conditions, train operations, mechanical systems, and human factors. The lead investigator was Dr. Kenneth Yates, 28 years in railroad accident investigation, who held a press conference at 10 a.m. outlining the preliminary findings. The train had been traveling at 79 miles per hour through a curve with a permanent speed restriction of 30 miles per hour, suggesting either operator error or some kind of mechanical failure that prevented the engineer from slowing the train appropriately. The locomotive's event data recorder and forward-facing camera had been recovered and were being analyzed. 6 passengers were confirmed dead, 41 remained hospitalized with serious injuries, and the investigation was focusing on why the train had been traveling at nearly triple the safe speed for that section of track. Dr. Yates said they were interviewing the surviving engineer and conductor, reviewing maintenance records for the locomotive and passenger cars, and examining the track infrastructure for any defects or unusual conditions that might have contributed to the accident. He emphasized that the investigation would be thorough, and that preliminary findings were subject to change as more evidence was analyzed, but that the excessive speed was clearly a primary factor in the severity of the derailment. I spent most of Sunday at Rebecca's bedside while Ethan stayed with my sister in Seattle. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about Rebecca's prognosis, saying she'd survived the critical first 24 hours and that her vital signs were stabilizing, but that brain injury recovery was unpredictable, and that they wouldn't know the full extent of cognitive damage until she regained consciousness. I sat in an uncomfortable chair watching my wife breathe through a tube, while news coverage of the derailment played on the room's television, showing the wreckage being examined by investigators, witnesses describing the moment of impact, officials updating casualty counts, and investigation timelines. The guilt was overwhelming and irrational and impossible to shake. If I'd forced Ethan out of the bathroom, if I'd broken down the door and dragged him to the car, if we'd made it to Union Station on time, Rebecca wouldn't have been traveling alone, wouldn't have been in whatever seat she'd selected by herself, might have been sitting somewhere safer in the train, or might have convinced me to rent a car instead, or might have been in an entirely different car that didn't slide down the embankment, or all three of us might have been injured or killed together. The randomness was unbearable. The way survival had come down to a 6-year-old locking himself in a bathroom for reasons he couldn't explain, beyond a nightmare that turned out to be terrifyingly accurate. The NTSB released preliminary findings on Monday evening that changed the entire nature of the investigation. Analysis of the event data recorder showed that the locomotive's braking system had been functioning normally, that the engineer had attempted to slow the train as it approached the restricted curve, but that the brake application had been ineffective at reducing speed. Further examination of the locomotive and passenger cars revealed that the brake lines on all 7 cars had been partially severed with what appeared to be deliberate cuts, designed to allow some brake pressure to reach the wheels while preventing full braking force from being applied. The cuts were precise and identical across all cars, located in sections of the brake system that wouldn't be visible during routine inspections, suggesting someone with detailed knowledge of train mechanics had sabotaged the braking system specifically to cause a high-speed derailment at a predictable location. Dr. Yates announced that the investigation was now being classified as criminal sabotage and that the FBI was taking jurisdiction alongside the NTSB. Special Agent Thomas Reeves, 21 years with the Bureau's Seattle field office, said they were treating this as domestic terrorism and that they were reviewing maintenance records, employee backgrounds, and security footage from the rail yard where the train had been serviced prior to the fatal run. The implications hit me with delayed force. Rebecca hadn't been injured in an accident caused by mechanical failure or operator error. She'd been injured in a deliberate attack, a planned act of violence that someone had executed with precision and intent to kill. The 6 dead passengers hadn't died in an unfortunate accident, but had been murdered by someone who'd sabotaged a train's brakes, knowing it would derail at high speed in a location where casualties were likely. And Ethan had somehow known this was going to happen, had refused to board that train based on a dream that predicted not just a crash, but a specific kind of crash involving high speed and tipping cars and people dying. The coincidence was impossible. The idea that a 6-year-old could have precognitive knowledge of a sabotage-induced derailment was scientifically absurd, but the alternative was accepting that pure chance had saved us while killing and injuring others, and that felt equally impossible. Detective Brennan called me on Monday night and asked if I'd be willing to bring Ethan in for an interview, that the FBI was interested in his nightmare, and whether it might contain details that could be relevant to the investigation. I asked if she seriously thought my 6-year-old son knew something about terrorism. She said no, but that children sometimes noticed unusual things adults overlooked, that his dream might have been influenced by something he'd seen or heard in the days before the derailment, and that any information could be valuable in identifying the saboteur. I agreed to bring him in Tuesday morning, partly because I wanted to help catch whoever had nearly killed my wife, and partly because I needed to understand whether Ethan's nightmare had been pure chance or something more inexplicable. The interview took place at the FBI's Seattle field office, in a room designed for interviewing children, with Detective Brennan present, alongside Special Agent Reeves and a child psychologist named Dr. Patricia Montgomery, 19 years specializing in forensic interviews with minors. They asked Ethan about his dream, about when he'd had it, and what specific details he could remember. He described the nightmare in careful detail. A train moving fast through green landscape near water, buildings and houses visible outside the windows, then the train shaking and tilting and sliding sideways, while people screamed and fell, and luggage flew through the air and windows shattered. He said he'd dreamed about being thrown against the wall of the train car, about seeing his mom reach for him but not being able to grab her hand, about water and trees getting closer through the broken windows before he woke up terrified and certain that getting on the 7:15 train would result in exactly what he'd dreamed. Dr. Montgomery asked if he'd watched any movies or videos about train crashes in the days before the nightmare. Ethan said no. She asked if anyone had talked to him about train safety or accidents or problems with trains. He said no, that his dad worked with environmental stuff, not trains, that his mom was a graphic designer, that nobody in his life had any particular knowledge of or concern about train operations. She asked if he'd noticed anything unusual about the train station or the Cascades Express or any of the people who worked there. He said he'd never been to Union Station before that morning and had never seen the train until we were supposed to board it. Agent Reeves asked a different kind of question. Had Ethan ever had dreams like this before? Dreams that predicted things before they happened? Ethan hesitated, then said sometimes he dreamed about things, and they came true later, like dreaming about his grandmother calling and then she called the next day, or dreaming about rain, and then it rained, but never anything big like this, never anything scary or dangerous. Reeves asked if anyone in his family had similar experiences, precognitive dreams or strong intuitions about future events. I said not that I knew of, that neither Rebecca nor I had ever experienced anything remotely like what Ethan was describing, that we were both practical people who dealt in evidence and measurable outcomes. Dr. Montgomery concluded the interview by saying Ethan appeared to have experienced what's sometimes called an anxiety dream, or precognitive nightmare, that it wasn't uncommon for sensitive children to have vivid dreams about potential dangers, especially when facing new experiences like international travel, but that there was no clear explanation for why his dream had matched the actual derailment so precisely, unless he'd somehow absorbed information about the sabotage without consciously registering it. She recommended ongoing therapy to help him process the trauma of his mother's injuries and his guilt about not being able to prevent the crash, but said she didn't believe Ethan had any investigative information beyond his unexplained fear. The FBI's investigation accelerated over the following week as they analyzed maintenance records and employee backgrounds and security footage from the rail yard where the Cascades Express had been stored and serviced prior to Saturday's departure. They discovered that the brake line cuts had been made sometime between Thursday evening and early Saturday morning, during a period when the train was parked in a maintenance facility with limited overnight security. Security cameras showed a maintenance worker named Russell Greer, 34 years old, 11 years with Amtrak, accessing the train at 11:47 p.m. on Friday night when no supervisors were present and spending approximately 2 hours working underneath the cars in areas consistent with where the brake lines had been severed. Greer had signed in using his employee credentials, claiming he was conducting routine inspections in preparation for Saturday's run, which was within his normal job responsibilities. But when FBI agents reviewed his work orders and maintenance logs, they found no documentation of any Friday night inspections on the Cascades Express, and his supervisor confirmed that Greer hadn't been scheduled to work that evening. Greer was arrested at his apartment in Tacoma on Thursday morning. FBI agents executing a search warrant found a laptop containing research about train derailments, brake system vulnerabilities, and high-speed crash physics. They found purchases of specialized cutting tools designed for severing metal lines without leaving obvious marks. They found maps of the Cascades route with the Edmonds curve marked in red, labeled with calculations about speed and derailment angles and estimated casualties. And they found a manifesto that explained his motive in writing so disturbing it made national headlines within hours of being discovered. Greer believed that passenger rail service in the United States was fundamentally corrupt, that Amtrak had prioritized profit over safety, that management had cut maintenance budgets and ignored safety concerns raised by workers like himself, and that the only way to force systemic reform was to cause a disaster dramatic enough to generate public outrage and political pressure. He'd selected the Cascades Express deliberately, chosen the Edmonds curve because its permanent speed restriction was frequently violated by engineers trying to maintain schedule, calculated that a high-speed derailment at that location would generate maximum casualties and media coverage while being attributable to operator error rather than sabotage. His plan had been to kill enough people that Congress would hold hearings, and the media would investigate Amtrak's safety culture, and the traveling public would demand reforms that workers had been requesting for years. The 6 deaths and 41 serious injuries weren't collateral damage in his mind, but necessary sacrifices to expose institutional negligence and force change. The FBI's press conference on Friday afternoon was broadcast on every major network. Agent Reeves announced that Russell Greer had been charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, 41 counts of attempted murder, sabotage of a rail vehicle, domestic terrorism, and numerous federal offenses that could carry multiple life sentences or the death penalty. He described the investigation, the evidence recovered from Greer's apartment and the maintenance facility, the surveillance footage showing tampering with the train, and the manifesto outlining his motive and planning. He confirmed that Greer had acted alone, that no other Amtrak employees were involved in the sabotage, and that enhanced security measures were being implemented across all passenger rail facilities nationwide. He expressed condolences to the victims' families and emphasized that this was an unprecedented case of an insider attack by a trusted employee who'd weaponized his maintenance access to commit mass murder disguised as an accident. The media coverage was overwhelming, with discussions about rail safety and insider threats, and the vulnerability of transportation infrastructure to sabotage by disgruntled workers. Passenger rail ridership dropped 40% nationwide within a week. Amtrak's stock price collapsed. Congress announced immediate hearings on rail security and employee vetting procedures, and families of the victims, including mine, tried to process the reality that our loved ones had been targeted not by external terrorists, but by someone who worked for the company they'd trusted with their safety. Rebecca regained consciousness on Saturday morning, 8 days after the derailment. I was sitting next to her bed reading news coverage on my phone when her eyes opened and she looked around the ICU with obvious confusion and fear. I called for the nurse and held Rebecca's hand gently while medical staff checked her responses and vital signs and tried to orient her to what had happened. Dr. Kapoor arrived within 15 minutes and conducted a neurological assessment, asking Rebecca basic questions about her name and the date and where she was. She could answer most of them, though her memory of the derailment itself was fragmented and unclear. She remembered being on the train, remembered it starting to shake and tilt, remembered hitting something hard and everything going dark, but nothing after that until waking up in the hospital. Dr. Kapoor said that memory loss surrounding traumatic events was common with brain injuries, that her cognitive function appeared relatively intact despite the trauma, and that she'd need extensive rehabilitation and monitoring, but that her prognosis was better than they'd initially feared. Rebecca looked at me and asked in a hoarse voice where Ethan was, if he was okay. I told her he was fine, that we'd both been home when the derailment happened, that we hadn't been on the train. She asked why not, and I explained about Ethan locking himself in the bathroom and refusing to board because of his nightmare. Her expression changed to something I couldn't read, confusion mixed with disbelief, mixed with something else. She said she remembered being angry that morning, remembered driving to the station alone, remembered thinking we were being ridiculous letting a child's bad dream ruin our vacation. Then she started crying, painful shaking sobs that made her injured ribs hurt, saying she should have listened, should have stayed home, should have taken Ethan's fear seriously instead of dismissing it as a tantrum. I brought Ethan to visit Rebecca on Sunday afternoon when she was stable enough for longer visits and off the ventilator, though still in ICU. He ran to her bed and grabbed her hand carefully, trying not to disturb the IV lines and bandages, saying he was sorry. He was so sorry he couldn't make her stay home, that he'd tried to stop us but hadn't tried hard enough. Rebecca told him through tears that he had nothing to be sorry for, that he'd saved Dad and himself, that his nightmare had been right, and that she wished she'd listened to him instead of being stubborn and angry. Ethan said he'd dreamed about the crash so clearly, had seen exactly what would happen, had known with certainty that getting on that train meant dying, and that he'd been so scared when Mom left anyway, because he knew she was heading toward the disaster he'd seen. Rebecca asked him how he'd known, how a dream could predict something so specific and terrible. He said he didn't know, that it had just felt absolutely real and absolutely certain, like remembering something that had already happened rather than imagining something that might happen. Dr. Montgomery, who'd been consulting on Rebecca's recovery, was present during this conversation, and later told me privately that while she couldn't explain Ethan's precognitive dream scientifically, she'd seen similar cases over her career, instances where children or sensitive individuals reported premonitions of disasters that proved accurate, and that current psychological and neurological science didn't have adequate frameworks to explain these phenomena beyond dismissing them as coincidence or pattern recognition. She said Ethan would likely struggle with guilt and responsibility for the rest of his life, feeling that he'd saved us but failed to save the other victims, and that addressing that guilt would be a major focus of his ongoing therapy. Russell Greer's trial began in April, 4 months after the derailment. I attended several days of testimony, sitting in the federal courthouse gallery with other victims' families, listening to prosecutors present overwhelming evidence of sabotage and murder. The case was straightforward in its facts, but disturbing in its implications. Greer had documented everything meticulously, keeping detailed logs of his planning and research and execution, apparently believing that transparency about his methods would strengthen his message about rail safety rather than simply proving his guilt. The prosecution presented 318 pieces of evidence, including the manifesto, the laptop files, purchase records for cutting tools, metallurgical analysis of the severed brake lines showing cut marks consistent with Greer's tools, surveillance footage showing him accessing the train during the critical period, and testimony from Amtrak employees about his access and behavior in the days before the derailment. They brought in Dr. Yates from the NTSB to explain how the brake line cuts had been designed to allow partial braking while preventing the train from slowing adequately for the restricted curve, creating the high-speed derailment Greer had calculated would generate maximum casualties. They presented passenger testimony from survivors who described the moment the train began tipping, the terror of realizing they were going to crash, the chaos of the impact, and the aftermath. They showed photos of the wreckage and the victims and the debris field scattered along the embankment. The defense attempted to argue that Greer had been suffering from mental illness, that his obsession with rail safety and his paranoid beliefs about Amtrak's negligence demonstrated impaired judgment, that he should be found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to psychiatric treatment. but the prosecution countered with evidence of Greer's careful planning, his research into sabotage methods, his selection of a specific location for maximum impact, his concealment of the brake line cuts through falsified maintenance records, and his documented awareness that he was committing murder. They played recordings of Greer's police interviews where he'd explained his methodology in precise technical detail, calculating the exact angle and depth of the cuts needed to weaken the brake lines without causing immediate failure, timing the sabotage to occur just before a scheduled run to minimize the chance of detection through routine inspections. The jury heard Greer describe his victims not as people, but as necessary casualties in his campaign to reform passenger rail safety, heard him express no remorse for the deaths he'd caused, heard him state that he'd considered sabotaging additional trains if the first derailment hadn't generated sufficient media attention and political pressure. The jury deliberated for 9 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts of murder, attempted murder, sabotage, and terrorism. Greer showed minimal reaction as the verdicts were read, sitting calmly at the defense table while victims' families wept or shouted or held each other in the gallery. The sentencing phase began immediately, with prosecutors seeking multiple consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The defense argued for leniency based on Greer's mental health issues and his stated intent to improve safety rather than cause harm, but Judge Ellen Crawford, 26 years on the federal bench, rejected these arguments. She called Greer's crime one of the most calculated and cruel acts of workplace violence she'd encountered, said he'd betrayed the trust placed in him as a maintenance worker, had weaponized his specialized knowledge to commit mass murder, and had shown complete disregard for human life in pursuit of an ideological goal. She sentenced him to 6 consecutive life sentences for the murders, plus additional time for the attempted murders and terrorism charges, ensuring he would die in federal prison regardless of any future appeals or legal challenges. Rebecca's physical recovery took 9 months of surgery and rehabilitation and physical therapy. The fractured femur healed but left her with a permanent limp and chronic pain that required ongoing medication. The traumatic brain injury caused persistent headaches and occasional memory problems and fatigue that limited her ability to work full-time. The psychological trauma was harder to quantify but equally debilitating, manifesting as anxiety about transportation and crowds and leaving the house, nightmares about the crash that woke her screaming several times a week, hypervigilance about safety that extended to obsessive checking of locks and smoke detectors and anything that might pose a risk. Dr. Nina Alvarez, 17 years specializing in trauma psychology, worked with Rebecca weekly to address PTSD symptoms and develop coping strategies, but acknowledged that full recovery might not be possible, that some survivors of mass violence carry permanent psychological scars that don't respond to conventional therapy. Rebecca had to accept that she was fundamentally changed by what happened, that the person who'd boarded the Cascades Express that morning expecting a pleasant vacation no longer existed, replaced by someone who understood viscerally that random violence could destroy your life in seconds and that all the planning and preparation and rational thinking in the world couldn't protect you from someone determined to cause harm. Ethan's therapy continued long after the trial ended, focused on processing his survivor's guilt and his unexplained precognitive knowledge of the derailment. Dr. Montgomery worked with him to understand that his nightmare had saved his own life and mine, but that he bore no responsibility for Rebecca's injuries or the other victims' deaths, that a 6-year-old child couldn't be expected to communicate a premonition in ways adults would take seriously, that he'd done everything he could by refusing to board. But I could see in Ethan's behavior that he'd internalized a sense of responsibility anyway, that he believed if he'd been more articulate or more insistent or more willing to explain the specific details of his dream, then maybe Rebecca would have listened, maybe the authorities would have investigated, maybe someone would have discovered the sabotage before the train departed. He developed anxiety about sleeping, afraid of having more nightmares that might predict disasters he couldn't prevent. He became hyper-aware of potential dangers, pointing out risks and hazards constantly, asking questions about what could go wrong in various situations. Dr. Montgomery said this was a normal trauma response, but also recommended evaluation by specialists in childhood precognition and unexplained phenomena, researchers who studied cases like Ethan's, where children reported advanced knowledge of events through dreams or intuition that couldn't be explained through conventional psychology or neuroscience. I spent months trying to rationalize what had happened, trying to find some logical explanation for how Ethan could have known about a sabotage-induced derailment days before it occurred. I researched precognitive dreams and found numerous documented cases of people reporting advanced knowledge of disasters, though most were dismissed by mainstream science as coincidence or pattern recognition or memory distortion after the fact. I consulted with psychologists and neurologists and even a few parapsychology researchers who specialized in unexplained phenomena, looking for frameworks that could account for Ethan's experience. The explanations ranged from quantum consciousness theories about time being nonlinear, to spiritual beliefs about souls having access to future information, to psychological arguments about the unconscious mind, picking up subtle environmental cues and processing them as premonitions. None of them felt satisfying or scientifically rigorous, but the alternative was accepting that pure random chance had created a coincidence so precise that my 6-year-old son dreamed the exact scenario of a sabotage attack he had no way of knowing about, and that felt equally impossible. What I came to understand, eventually, was that the explanation didn't matter as much as the outcome. Ethan had refused to board that train for whatever reason, whether precognition or coincidence or something we don't have language to describe, and that refusal had saved our lives while Rebecca's decision to board anyway had nearly cost hers. The randomness of survival, the way life and death came down to a child locking himself in a bathroom and a wife choosing vacation plans over family unity, was something I couldn't rationalize or accept or make peace with. I could only acknowledge it and carry it forward and try to honor the 6 people who died and the 41 who were seriously injured by working to make transportation systems safer, so that future Russell Greers couldn't weaponize their access and knowledge to commit mass murder. I took a position with the Federal Railroad Administration 2 years after the derailment, using my engineering background to consult on safety protocols and insider threat prevention and security standards for maintenance facilities. The work gave me purpose and a way to channel the trauma into something constructive, developing systems designed to prevent another sabotage attack by a trusted employee. Rebecca eventually returned to part-time graphic design work, though her injuries and PTSD limited what she could handle. We sold our house in Ballard and moved to a single-story home in Redmond with better accessibility for Rebecca's mobility issues. Our marriage survived, though it changed in ways we're still navigating, marked by the permanent before and after division of life, pre-derailment and post-derailment. Ethan is 9 now, still in therapy, still processing what happened and what he knew and why he couldn't save everyone. He doesn't have nightmares about disasters anymore, or at least he doesn't tell us when he does, keeping whatever premonitions or anxieties he experiences private rather than sharing them with adults who might not believe or might not be able to help. He's become careful and quiet and observant, watching the world with an awareness that seems beyond his years, always calculating risks and noting dangers, and staying alert for threats that might not be visible to others. Dr. Montgomery says this hypervigilance may decrease with time or may be a permanent part of his personality now, shaped by the knowledge that his instincts were right when everyone else's were wrong, that his fear saved lives even when the adults around him dismissed it as irrational. Russell Greer remains in federal prison, his appeals exhausted, his life sentences upheld through multiple court reviews. He's given interviews to researchers and journalists, still explaining his reasoning, still arguing that his sabotage was necessary to expose Amtrak's negligence and force reforms, still showing no remorse for the people he killed or the lives he destroyed. The passenger rail industry implemented sweeping security changes in response to the attack, including enhanced background checks for maintenance workers, mandatory 2-person teams for all safety-critical work, continuous video surveillance of maintenance facilities, and automated monitoring of brake systems and other critical components. These reforms came too late for the victims of the Cascades Express derailment, but they've likely prevented future attacks by making insider sabotage significantly more difficult. I think about that morning sometimes, about Ethan behind the locked bathroom door while Rebecca drove away angry, and I stood in our hallway trying to decide between forcing my son onto a train or missing a vacation. About how that decision, made in frustration and confusion with no knowledge of what was waiting 16 minutes into the journey, determined who lived and who suffered and how our family would be permanently altered. About how a 6-year-old's nightmare was more accurate than any risk assessment or safety analysis or rational evaluation of transportation statistics. About how the systems we trust to keep us safe can be weaponized by the people we trust to maintain them. Rebecca asks me sometimes if I think Ethan really knew, if his nightmare was genuinely precognitive, or just an impossible coincidence that happened to align with reality. I tell her I don't know, that I've stopped trying to find rational explanations for something that defies rational explanation, that whether it was precognition or luck or divine intervention or quantum probability or something else entirely, the outcome is the same. Our son saved our lives by refusing to board a train he was certain would crash, and that certainty proved accurate in ways we'll never fully understand. The memorial for the derailment victims stands near the Edmonds waterfront, 6 names carved in stone representing 6 people who died because a maintenance worker decided their deaths would serve a greater purpose. I visit sometimes, standing there trying to comprehend the randomness of who lived and who died, who listened to a child's fear and who dismissed it, who made it home that Saturday and who never will. There's no justice adequate for what Greer did, no punishment that returns the dead or heals the permanently injured or erases the trauma. There's only the cold fact of 6 consecutive life sentences and the small satisfaction that he'll never harm anyone else. Ethan saved us. However he knew, whatever he sensed or dreamed or intuited about that train, his refusal to board was the only reason we're still here. And I carry that knowledge forward every day, trying to trust his instincts the way I failed to trust them that morning, trying to believe him when he says something feels wrong, even if I can't see the danger myself, trying to honor the gift of survival by making systems safer for others. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.